So let's start with a bit of a hypothetical today.
Okay, lay it on me.
Imagine you are sitting in the captain's chair of a major government, a regime that has held power for over 40 years now.
Right.
And you look at your dashboard and basically every single light is blinking red.
A total system failure type of scenario.
Exactly. I mean, your economy is absolutely crippled by sanctions. You have a superpower like the United States threatening this maximum pressure campaign.
Yeah.
Plus, you have a regional military power that has effectively dismantled your forward operating bases. And maybe the most dangerous part.
The domestic situation.
Right. Your own population has made it very clear through repeated protests that they are just done with you.
It is the classic dictator in the bunker scenario. You are totally cornered.
You're cornered. So if you take any standard political science course or even just look at history, the move here is obvious. It's the rational actor model.
Which means you compromise.
You compromise to survive. Because historically, the #1 goal of any authoritarian system is just to stay in power, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Survival is the prime directive. Ideology usually takes a back seat when the actual existence of the regime is on the line.
But what happens when a regime stops looking at the political chessboard and starts looking at, well, magic?
Yeah, that is the really baffling mystery we are unpacking today.
What if instead of cutting a deal, they dig in and start talking about invisible weapons and spiritual force fields?
We are looking at a really deep analysis of the Islamic Republic of Iran's current behavior today, specifically drawing on a discussion featuring the analyst Faraj Sarkohi from the channel Sadeh Saiha.
And just to be clear for you listening, we are just reporting on the analysis presented in this source. Sarkohi argues that we aren't really watching a standard geopolitical standoff anymore.
No, we might actually be witnessing a psychological collapse. He draws a very specific and frankly chilling parallel.
The Berlin Syndrome.
The Berlin Syndrome, exactly. Think of the final days of the Third Reich. April 1945 in the bunker in Berlin.
When everything is falling apart.
Right. At that stage, the leadership stopped making decisions based on maps and logistics. They started relying on this intense belief in miracle weapons. The Wunderwaffe.
To save them at the very last second.
Yes. A total detachment from military reality.
That is a heavy comparison.
Huh?
So in this deep dive, we're going to explore why the logical case for negotiation is just being ignored. We'll look at the shift from true believers to what Sarkozy calls rentier loyalists.
And we definitely need to get to the part about the plasma technology.
Oh, I promise we will get to the plasma and the djinn. It sounds like science fiction, but the source argues it's actually critical to understanding why traditional diplomacy might just be dead in the water here.
It really changes how you view their decision-making process.
Okay, let's start with the logic first. Because before we get to the supernatural stuff, we have to establish what a rational move would actually look like in this situation.
Right, setting the baseline.
Sarkozy points out that the pressures on the Islamic Republic are overwhelming right now. You've got Trump potentially returning. You've got the Israeli military readiness.
And do not forget the domestic pressure. The source specifically mentions the day protests showing that the people aren't just unhappy. The wall of fear has cracked.
So they know they're sitting on a powder keg.
They know it. And logically, they should be sprinting to the negotiating table.
And Sarkozy argues there's actually a pretty good deal to be made right. It's not like the door is completely welded shut.
That's the really fascinating part of his analysis. Sarkozy sketches out what a survival deal would look like. It is actually quite pragmatic.
What does that look like?
First, you offer the U.S. president an economic win. You say, come invest in our oil. Let American companies make money here.
Which plays right into a transactional political stuff.
Exactly. It's a win that can be sold on TV. But the sticking point usually is the nuclear program. And this is where Sarkozy makes a really interesting technical argument.
Okay.
He argues the regime could actually give up their 60% enriched uranium without really hurting their core defense strategy.
Well, let me push back on that a little bit. Because 60% enriched uranium is huge. That is their massive leverage. If they give that up, aren't they just surrendering their biggest card?
You would definitely think so, but look at the actual physics of it. Sarkozy points out that 60% is this weird middle ground.
How so?
It's highly enriched, yes, but you cannot put it in a missile warhead. To actually make a bomb, you need 90%.
Oh, I see.
So right now, that 60% stockpile is just sitting there. It is provocative, but it is not a functional weapon.
So it's basically a bargaining chip that has no immediate military use for them?
Precisely. Sarkozy's argument is you trade away the uranium, which you can't use yet anyway, And in exchange, you demand to keep the missiles.
Because the missiles are the actual deterrent.
Right. They view the missile program as their absolute shield. If they give up the missiles, they feel naked.
But if they give up the enrichment to satisfy the West and open the oil fields for economic investment,
Then they survive. They stay in power.
and theoretically, wouldn't the Iranian elite absolutely love this? I mean, the people with all the
Well,
money.
the aristocracy would be thrilled. Sarkozy points out that the wealthy elite, the oligarchs in Tehran, are really desperate to connect their wealth to the global market.
Because right now, their money's just trapped inside the country.
Exactly, trapped.
Hmm.
If you are a billionaire in Tehran, you cannot easily buy real estate in London. You can't invest on Wall Street.
You are totally blocked off.
You are stuck. If the regime normalizes relations suddenly, that wealth becomes global. The source even mentions that researchers in regime-affiliated think tanks, places like Imam Hussein University, are quietly writing papers suggesting exactly this strategy.
Well, so let's recap the rational side of the board here for a second. You have a clear path to survival. You have an economic incentive for your elites. You have an adversary who likes making deals.
The off-ramp is right there. It is wide open.
But they aren't taking it. In
Right.
fact, they seem to be accelerating in the exact opposite direction.
Right.
Is it just stubbornness?
It goes deeper than that. This leads to the second key part of Sarkozy's analysis, which is the erosion of their actual support base.
Okay, let's get into that. Because we tend to think of the Islamic Republic as having this very solid core of ideological diehards.
The true believers who are there for the revolution.
Right. But Sarkozy argues that has largely vanished, hasn't it?
It really has. We have moved from ideological believers to what he calls rentier loyalists.
Rentier loyalists. That sounds like a very academic term. Let's break that down for the listener.
Basically, a rentier state is a government that doesn't rely on taxing its own people. It relies on selling a resource, usually oil, to foreigners.
So it gets rents.
Yes, it gets rents, and it uses that massive influx of cash to just fund the government and buy compliance.
Which means they don't really need the people's consent because they don't rely on the people's taxes.
Exactly. But here's the crucial shift Sarkozy identifies. The loyalty of the regime's enforcers, the besieged, the mid-level managers, it is no longer based on religious conviction.
It's based on the rent. It is purchased.
It is entirely transactional now. The system buys loyalty through subsidies, through positions of power, and just corruption opportunities.
But isn't that incredibly fragile? I mean, if your loyalty is just a business transaction, what happens when the business goes broke?
That is the rentier trap, and that is exactly what they are. Sarkozy points out that because of heavy sanctions and economic mismanagement, the regime is literally running out of money.
So they can't pay the rent on their loyalists anymore?
Correct. And unlike a true believer who will gladly starve for the ideological cause, a rentier loyalist just walks away when the check bounces.
Or worse, they turn on you.
Exactly. So they are in this massive catch-22. To keep the loyalty of their security apparatus, they need money.
And to get money, they need to deal with the West to lift the sanctions.
But the hardliners fear that if they make a deal, they lose their remaining ideological legitimacy.
And if they lose that legitimacy, they fear the whole house of cards comes down anyway.
They are completely paralyzed. And this paralysis is what pushes them toward the third and, I think, scariest part of this deep dive.
The psychological collapse.
Yes, when you cannot solve your problems politically because you're paralyzed and you cannot solve them economically because you're broke.
You retreat into fantasy.
This is the Berlin syndrome, the bunker mentality. Sarkozy argues the regime is no longer operating on a political model. It is operating on a delusion.
They're waiting for a miracle.
And we aren't using miracle as just a metaphor here. The source material gets really specific about some bizarre beliefs circulating at the very top.
Yeah, we need to talk about plasma. I honestly had to reread this part of the source material when I was prepping because I want to be sure I wasn't looking at some fringe conspiracy blog.
I know it sounds wild, but this comes from a serious political discussion.
Right. So Sarkozy references a commentator, Mr. Amini, who shares this account from a regime insider, someone deep in the system.
And this insider was asked, basically, aren't you worried? Israel is dismantling your regional defenses. The Americans are applying pressure. Aren't you going to lose?
And the response wasn't something like, no, our missiles are good or our strategy is solid.
No, the response was, we won't lose. War won't happen. Because we have plasma.
Okay, and just to clarify for you listening, he does not mean a high-definition television. What exactly is he talking about?
He is referring to a rumored secret weapon, plasma technology. The belief among some in this inner circle is that the Islamic Republic possesses a classified technology that just defies the laws of physics.
Like something out of a comic book.
Exactly. Something
Yeah.
that can magically disable American electronics or wipe out entire armies instantly.
Is the secret weapon delusion. The Wunderwaffe.
It is exactly like Hitler in 1945,
Yeah.
telling everyone the V-2 rockets will save us, the new jet fighters will save us.
That's a psychological coping mechanism.
That's all it is. If you convince yourself you have a magic weapon that nobody else knows about, you don't have to face the reality that you are actually losing the geopolitical game.
But the severe danger here is that they might actually base their real-world military strategy on this delusion.
That is the terrifying implication. If you think you have an invincible magic shield, you might provoke a fight you literally cannot win.
And it gets even deeper into the metaphysical, right? We have to talk about the ring.
Oh, the ring, yes. This is where it gets truly surreal.
This is from the Student News Agency, which the source notes is not some fringe tabloid. It is affiliated with the Basij militia.
Yes, this is state-affiliated media we are talking about. Right after the death of Hassan Nasrallah, they published an analysis of the specific ring Supreme Leader Khamenei was wearing.
And they were not doing a fashion review or talking about the gemstone's value.
No, not at all. They claim the ring was specifically designed to, and I am quoting the source material here, ward off jinn and break the alliance between enemies and dark forces.
Jinn being the supernatural spirits or demons in Islamic theology.
Yes. They are literally arguing in state media that the reason that enemies are winning is not because of better intelligence or superior air forces or economics.
It's because the enemy has formed an alliance with actual demons.
And the countermeasure to F-35 fighter jets and satellite intelligence is a magic ring.
Just stop and think about that for a second. We are talking about a state that is on the nuclear threshold, a state with a massive conventional army and missile program.
And the official media is discussing military strategy in terms of breaking alliances with dark spirits.
It suggests just a total and complete detachment from reality. I mean, how do you even negotiate with that?
You can't. That is exactly Sarkozy's point. If I am a diplomat, I can negotiate over oil prices. I can negotiate over centrifuge numbers and uranium stockpiles.
But I cannot negotiate with someone who genuinely thinks I am commanding an army of jinn.
It really reinforces that Berlin comparison. It is that profound isolation.
The leader sitting in a room surrounded by sycophants who are terrified to tell him the truth.
So they feed him stories about plasma weapons and magic rings to keep him happy.
And Sarkozy makes a really sharp point about this, too. He says, Khamenei himself, maybe he believes it, maybe he doesn't.
But the system around him relies on these myths to keep going.
Right. They desperately need to believe there is a divine intervention coming. Because if there isn't, they have to look at the actual economic numbers.
And the numbers say they are doomed, the rent is running out.
So naturally, when people look at a crumbling, highly ideological anti-Western regime, the comparison that always comes up is the Soviet Union.
It is the go-to historical analogy for sure. Is this just the USSR 2.0?
The source asks this directly. Is Iran heading for a Soviet-style collapse? Because there are obvious similarities, right? The rigid ideology, the economic failure, the aging leadership.
It is very tempting to say, yes, it's the same thing. But Sarkozy actually pushes back on this comparison quite a bit.
Why is that?
He argues that while the symptoms look similar, the poverty, the massive corruption, the disease itself is fundamentally different.
How so? Because the Soviet Union collapsed relatively peacefully, all things considered.
Right. Think about why the USSR collapsed. It was almost entirely internal. The economy just couldn't sustain the arms race. Gorbachev tried to implement reforms, and the system just sort of dissolved under its own weight.
True. There were no American tanks rolling toward Moscow in 1989. Nobody was bombing their bases.
Exactly. But Iran feels under active siege. They face direct existential military threats from the outside right now.
And that creates a siege mentality that the Soviets didn't really have at the very end.
It rallies the hardliners. It gives them an external enemy to point to.
And what about the people actually running the show? The security apparatus?
That is the critical difference Sarkozy highlights. He points out that the Soviet apparatus, the KGB, the Red Army generals, they were essentially just bureaucrats at the end of the day.
They had jobs to do.
Right. When they realized the communist system was broken and wasn't paying out anymore, they didn't burn Moscow to the ground to try and save it.
They just stepped aside.
They stepped aside and they became the new oligarchs. They had an exit strategy. They could take off the military uniform and put on a nice business suit.
But the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards in Iran, They are a different story.
Sarkozy describes them as fundamentally different. They are far more violent, far more ideological, and deeply, deeply entrenched in a way the Soviet bureaucrats simply weren't.
They operate almost like a militarized mafia economy.
And crucially, they have no exit. They believe, and honestly, probably correctly, that if the regime falls, they don't get to just retire to a villa on the Caspian Sea.
They get put on trial. Or worse.
They are fighting for their actual lives, so we shouldn't expect a Gorbachev moment where someone from the inside just stands up and says, okay, guys, this isn't working. Let's open up the country.
Sarkozy thinks that is highly unlikely.
Yes. The regime has definitely been pragmatic in the past. They accepted the ceasefire with Iraq when they absolutely had to. They cooperated in Afghanistan when it suited them.
But Sarkozy's argument is that pragmatism seems to have completely evaporated.
The Berlin syndrome has taken over entirely. They aren't acting like the calculated survivors of the past. They are acting like they are cornered in the bunker.
Which brings us to the really sobering conclusion of this analysis.
Yeah.
We have a regime that has historically prioritized its own survival above everything else, but now faced with arguably the biggest threats in its history, it is acting against its own survival interests.
Because of that bunker mentality, if you truly believe you can just wait out the storm because of plasma technology or because of spiritual intervention, you miss the window to make a rational political deal.
You wait too long and the options disappear.
Exactly. And for the listener, the scary part is what Sarkozy concludes about the future. Whether they make a deal or not, the shadow of conflict remains.
How does he figure that?
Well, if they don't deal, conflict is highly likely because the West simply won't tolerate a nuclear Iran. But even if they do manage some temporary deal, the underlying structure, the friction with the region, the brutal internal suppression, it all remains.
As long as this specific structure holds instability, is just the baseline.
It's baked in.
It is a really sobering analysis. Because we so often look at geopolitics as this rational game of chess. You know, I move my pawn, you move your knight. We assume all the players are rational.
Yeah. We assume they all want to survive above all else.
But what if one player has just flipped the board entirely and is trying to cast a spell?
That changes the entire game.
It really does. And that is the provocative thought we want to leave you with today as we wrap up this deep dive.
It's a big one.
We spend so much time analyzing enriched uranium percentages and oil sanction data, the hard, measurable numbers.
Things we can put on a spreadsheet.
Right. But when a political system begins heavily relying on magic rings and imaginary plasma weapons to solve real-world military and economic crises.
Is it even possible to predict their behavior using traditional logic at all?
Or have we entered a phase where the only thing we can accurately predict is chaos?
It is definitely a question that keeps analysts up at night.
Well, on that cheerful note, that is going to do it for this deep dive. Thanks so much for listening, and we will catch you on the next one.
Stay curious.